The first potential problem that you might actually have if you were to form an LLC is that equity compensation is complicated in an LLC. People talk about, well, LLC is great, LLC is great, okay, but equity compensation is very complicated. Let me just develop a little bit. One of the most attractive incentives for startups is to offer employees, advisors, and other service providers is equity compensation in the form of restricted stock and stock options. So people seem to have a general understanding of how this works. In contrast, providing equity compensation in entities taxed as partnerships is much more difficult, complex, and expensive to draft and administer than equity compensation in a C corporation. So the equivalent of a stock grant in an LLC is called a profits interest, which when issued often makes the LLC book up the capital accounts of the owners prior to granting the profits interest. This same complication occurs when options or warrants to acquire LLC interest. Additionally, if a W-2 employee receives a profits interest, then she or he will be treated as a partner for tax purposes and can no longer be treated as a W-2 employee. Now, those have consequences. First of all, I'm going to talk about the equity compensation later on, but I just want to quickly talk about the tax implication here. So the tax transfer here. So when we talk about partner versus W-2 employee, so when you become a partner, that means what? That means the LLC has to issue a Schedule K-1 for that former employee. So that employee who became a partner. So basically, instead of having a W-2, so a W-2 and 1099, depending on the status of the employee, we have now a Schedule K-1. Now, if that employee is not really, I would say, armed with all the proper fiscal expertise, he or she might have some problems. In other words, you have to understand, if you are a Schedule K-1 sort of employee, that means what? You are receiving Schedule K-1 from the LLC, and you have to file this on your tax return with your 1040. So now I want to talk about the complication in terms of equity compensation. You understand that if you are a startup, a lot of people, advisors, employees, they love the fact that they can actually become millionaires overnight by working for a startup and making that startup be successful. But in LLC, this is very complicated. Okay, the profits interest sort of scheme is not the same thing as stock options and all the other, like the restricted stock that you have with regular startups. In other words, C corporations. So it is what it is. So the very first thing is equity compensation is complicated in the LLC. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. You are going to enjoy today's conversation. The second thing is LLCs are not eligible for Section 1202 gain exclusion. Let me break it down for you. Section 1202 is one of the most exciting tax incentives for founders and investors alike. This section of the tax code allows founders and investors to exclude up to $10 million in capital gains from the sale of qualified small business stock, and stock of most startups qualify as a qualified small business stock. This is really huge. Think about it. $10 million. This is huge. And Section 1202 cannot be used to exclude gains from the sale of interest in LLCs. Note that some types of businesses, including restaurants, are not eligible for Section 1202 gain exclusion altogether anyway. Let me break it down a little bit because, you probably hear this term 1202 for the first time. Let me break it down for you. So what is Section 1202? Section 1202, also called the Small Business Stock Gains Exclusion, is a portion of the Internal Revenue Code that allows capital gains from select small business stock to be excluded from federal tax. Section 1202 of the IRS Code only applies to qualified small business stock, so the QSBS, acquired after September 27, 2010, that is held for more than 5 years. 5 years. So this is really important because you have to really be clear here. Now, under Section 1202, capital gains from certain small business stocks are excluded from federal tax, so the IRS can't touch it. So again, we're talking about $10 million, up to $10 million. This portion of the tax code provides an incentive for non-corporate taxpayers to invest in small businesses. And not all small business stocks qualify, however. The amount of gain excluded under Section 1202 is limited to a maximum of $10 million or 10 times the adjusted basic of the stock. So again, 10 times the adjusted basis of the stock. So when we talk about 1202 in general, you're talking about a very important pattern that allows people to actually make money. But if you have an LLC, you cannot qualify. So LLCs are not eligible for Section 1202 gain exclusion. This is why a lot of major investors, I'm talking about the angel investors, I'm talking about all those hedge fund, all those millionaires and multimillionaires and billionaires, they do not want to actually invest in an LLC, among other things, of course. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about the reasons why you should not form an LLC. Third, LLCs can complicate investor tax situations. Really, investors frequently do not want to complicate their personal tax situation by becoming a member in an entity taxed as a partnership. And LLCs are most frequently taxed as partnerships. Remember, when you're an LLC, you have the option to be taxed as a corporation or as a partnership. And if you're a single member LLC, you can be taxed as a sole proprietorship. So those are the three options that exist here. And the IRS, if you're taxed as a sole proprietorship, the IRS will regard you as a disregarded entity. Now, the reason why the LLCs the reason why investors don't want to actually associate themselves with LLCs, because again, if LLCs by the vast majority will want to be taxed as a partnership, which means what? It means that you will file an informational return, Form 1065, at the end of the year. And you will also file along with this informational return schedule, something called Schedule K1, and you will distribute that Schedule K1 to each member of the LLC, aka partnership. And that member will take that Schedule K1 and will file their personal return here. So they will actually take the income on their Schedule K1 and actually put it on their Schedule C. Okay, so those are really important. So the thing is that members of LLC tax as partnerships receive a Form K1 from the entity which allocates income and losses to the member. So investors do not want that. They don't like it. Members will be taxed on the LLC's income even if no cash is distributed to you to pay the taxes. The investor's ability to file his own or her own tax return is depending on receipt of the K1. And if there are problems with the K1, the investor could have to amend its tax returns. And if the startup has an active trade or business and does business in other states, investors may become subject to income tax in those other states, which would really obligate them to file a tax return in multiple states. So you can see here that something that may be seemingly be very simple can become very complicated. So, and if you have an LLC that actually is active in multiple states, that means that investor will have to file taxes in 10 states or 15 states or 20 states. And, this can be really complicated. So investors really want to keep their tax situation very simple. And so LLCs can really complicate investor tax situations. The fourth thing here is that many investors cannot invest in LLCs point blank. It's just what it is. I mean, the vehicle itself is not attractive enough to some investors. Let me break it down for you. See, some investors such as venture capital funds, so we're talking about VC firms, cannot invest in pass-through companies because they have tax-exempt partners which do not want to receive active trade or business income because of their tax-exempt status. Many accelerators also require startups to incorporate as a C corporation prior to being accepted into the accelerator program. Business angel investors are individual investors, often successful business owners who are investing their own personal funds into a potentially rewarding business opportunity, often in an early stage or startup business. And angel investors have experience and contacts to contribute and may be willing to be hands-off. Whereas venture capital is invested by firms or companies that use other people's money. So venture capital is seldom invested in early stage. They have many contacts and often require a seat on the board. Okay. And so they raise that money by offering investors a chance to take part in a fund that is then used to buy shares in a private company. So generally, If the business is in an early stage, then business angels are the most likely source of funding. And what will happen here is that venture capital firms may come on board at a later stage when the concept is proven and initial revenue obtained in order to more quickly expand the company. If your startup is absolutely determined to raise venture capital, there is only one viable legal entity decision your startup can make: the C corporation. And most venture capitalists are unwilling or unable to invest in any other business entity, simply because of those legal requirements that I just spoken to you about. And so why venture capitalists don't like LLCs? Well, limited liability companies are often very popular form of organizing small businesses. In essence, they are a hybrid entity that provides the limited liability protection of a C corporation with the tax benefits of a partnership. LLCs are also incredibly easy to set up. One of the main problems with LLC is the tax implications, which deter and in some cases even prevent venture capitalists from investing. In addition, LLCs are especially problematic because venture capitalists have a strong focus on getting to an exit to eventually convert ownership into profits for VCs. Startups typically need to IPO or be bought by another company. The problem with transferring your LLC to a C corporation is that it is rather complicated to transfer or sell partial ownership in an LLC. So this is really, this is really what you have to think about. I mean, becoming an LLC is fairly easy, don't get me wrong, but actually exiting is just very complicated. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about the reasons why you should not form an LLC. The next thing is that many investors prefer the familiarity and simplicity of owning stock in a C corporation. And the thing here is that, investors are less familiar with LLCs than corporations, so they typically have to spend more time on due diligence when it comes to reviewing the underlying documents before deciding whether or not to invest. And so when you really think about it, this will really increase the due diligence cost and requires them to spend more time understanding the startup's entity when they could use that time to better understand the startup's business and prospects. So, again, we're talking about the firms that it really, like, if you have an angel, a VC firm, for instance, really their time is money, really. So investors in early stage businesses usually just want to make an investment, acquire stock, and not have any intervening tax complications like a Form K-1 and potential taxation in other states until the stock is sold and there is a capital gain or loss event. In other words, those people, those very sophisticated people, they just want things to be very simple. And LLCs do not make the job a lot easier for them to actually move on to the next stage. You need to understand, LLC, it's not LLC's fault. It's just how the product is structured. So basically, you have a product that actually favors some people and doesn't favor others, right? So an LLC favors the owners because it's really great in terms of shielding them from personal liability, also protecting their personal assets. But in terms of having people having external investors, external partners coming into the firm, is just really complicated. So this is one reason why it's not really easy. Another reason, I really want to insist on the tax situation here. Investors, not because they're scared about the tax implications. You need to understand, investors, they really invest in several companies. Imagine if all those companies were LLCs and they have to file how many gazillion tax returns at the end of the year. Imagine that. Because see, you're talking about, one LLC, you're like, why can't they just file 5 tax returns of 10 tax returns? Okay. But what if an investor has a portfolio of 100 companies? And all those 100 companies, out of those 100, you have 20 or 25 or 50, there are LLCs. And those LLCs are in 50 states. I mean, think about it. Because there are some LLCs that they're actually present nationwide. So you have to file a tax return in all 50 states. That's crazy. You're talking about like investors really hiring an entire team, and that team only job is to help them file tax returns. It's very crazy. So that's why they don't like it. Another thing is that convertible debt can be complicated and have negative tax consequences. Let's talk about that. So one of the most common initial funding methods to raising capital for startups is through the sale of convertible promissory notes, but notes must be structured differently when issued from an LLC taxed as a partnership to avoid negative tax consequences. If not structured properly, basically what will happen here is that the conversion of the note itself can result in phantom income. In other words, taxable income without any receipt of cash to the investor. Also, if the startup does not make it, then the founders may have to recognize forgiveness of debt upon the dissolution of the LLC, and this also can include some kind of phantom income also. So the bottom line here is what you need to understand. Basically, convertible notes, convertible debts, and I even don't want to talk about the accounting implications of it. I just want to insist on the taxation part of it, because see, for investors, they want to make money, right? And they do not want to pay the IRS unless and until they make money. So why would they actually pay income tax on phantom income? So if you're paying income tax without having any gain, you're actually losing money. And again, when we talk about one LLC, it's okay. But when you multiply the fact that you have multiple investors, and when you have multiple LLCs for investors, it's just too complicated. And the thing I want to say here is that I also want to mention the fact that there is conversion to C corporation that creates an additional layer of problems here, of complexity, if you will. It's because at some point, if the LLC wants to become a C corporation with an ultimate goal of filing for an IPO, and the process is not done correctly, what will happen here is that you will create additional tax liabilities for investors, and this can be really problematic. And this is why investors are really shying away from LLC form of businesses, because of the fact that it's just really complicated. One thing I want to say also is that you need to understand is two things there investors are really being scared about. It's just because the debt conversion process itself is complicated, and the second thing is that it can have negative tax consequences. So, this is like double 2-in-1. It's just too much for investors. And again, investors are professional moneymakers. They just want to have something simple. They bring the money, they bring the expertise, they bring the contacts, and in return, they actually are able to make money. That's all. Another thing is that raising capital is more difficult to do through an LLC. And it's really important to understand that when you actually raising capital through an LLC is much more difficult than raising a next round through a corporation. LLC agreements are more difficult and complex to prepare than their corporate counterparts. Additionally, you could be hit upon sticky and highly complex tax issues in the LLC context that just do not exist or arise in the corporate context. In contrast, most financings are based on widely used forms of agreements. They are set up for C corporations, which reduces the complexity and legal cost of raising capital. So it's really important to understand that if you want to actually succeed ASAP and to really do the things the right way, you need to understand that having the proper sort of schedule, the proper fundraising scheduling is really important. And so basically, you need to apply for business funding. So I'm just explaining to you the process that leads to business funding through LLC. So you apply for business funding. That's one way. So you can get a loan, you can get a small business loan, you can get a small business line of credit, or you can bring on a new LLC member. So this is kind of cool because an LLC can have multiple owners called members. So this is where investors can actually come in as a member. And bringing on a new owner and forming a partnership can increase your access to capital through what is called capital accounts. The new member should contribute seed money to your LLC, plus they may have a network of connections to willing investors. So you need to be sure to update your operating agreement accordingly and document your capital accounts thoroughly. And this is where basically investors don't want to have complications. Or you can look for a grant. Okay. And another reason why investors, like, you really should not do an LLC until you actually listen to all these videos all through is because LLCs are generally obligated to make tax distributions to members to cover tax obligations arising from the allocation of the LLC's income to its members. So this is really important. And so the thing is that LLCs do not pay tax on their earnings and instead allocate the earnings to the members of the LLC via the K-1. If a startup is fortunate to have income, then investors are likely to include obligations in the governing documents of the LLC that make distributions to cover the federal and state tax obligations stemming from the allocated income at the highest tax rates of the members. This obligation can result in the LLC having to distribute a significant portion of the earnings to its members. In contrast, C corporations are currently only subject to a low federal tax of 21%, which means they can actually save more cash to use to grow the business. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I explained to you a few of the reasons why you should not form an LLC. Let me quickly recap here. Number one, equity compensation is complicated in LLC. Number two, LLCs are not eligible for Section 1202 gain exclusion. Number three, LLCs can complicate investor tax situations. Number four, many investors cannot invest in LLCs. Number five, many investors prefer the familiarity and simplicity of owning stock in a C corporation. Number six, convertible debt can be complicated and have negative tax consequences. Number seven, raising capital is more difficult through an LLC. Number eight, last but not the least, LLCs are generally obligated to make tax distributions to members to cover tax obligations arising from the allocation of the LLC's income to its members. Thank you so much for your attention. God bless you. I'll speak to you another time, but until then, remember, stay marvelous.